"You just ruined a $10,000 dress," the young man said with a laugh, lifting his wine glass as if he had accomplished something worth celebrating. The sound of his voice cut through the ballroom like a crack in polished glass. Conversation stalled. Heads turned. Crystal chandeliers reflected across the marble floor of the Grand Regent Hotel in Manhattan, where more than 400 executives, investors, and philanthropists had gathered for one of the most exclusive charity galas of the year. At the center of the room stood Naomi Brooks. A stream of red wine slowly spread across the front of her navy evening gown. The stain was impossible to miss. So was the smile on Ethan Whitmore's face. 22 years old, born into wealth, and completely certain the world existed for his amusement, Ethan looked at Naomi as though she were the punchline to a private joke. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to notice. Then came the sound that made the moment worse. Laughter. Not from strangers. From Ethan's parents. Victoria Whitmore covered her mouth, but not before a grin slipped through. Richard Whitmore shook his head and chuckled into his drink. Neither seemed particularly concerned that their son had just humiliated a woman in the middle of a packed ballroom. "Maybe next time you'll watch where you're standing," Ethan said. His tone carried the confidence of someone who had never been told he was wrong. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the wine soaking into the fabric. She didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't demand an apology. The silence unsettled several people nearby more than any angry response could have. It was the kind of silence that felt deliberate, controlled, as if she were measuring the room rather than the insult. Across the ballroom, servers paused beside silver trays. A violin quartet continued playing near the stage, but even the music seemed quieter now. Victoria stepped closer to her son. "Honestly, Ethan," she said, smiling, "you should be more careful." Yet her voice carried no real criticism. It sounded more like encouragement. Ethan shrugged. "She'll survive." A few guests laughed nervously. Others looked away. Naomi reached for a linen napkin from a nearby table and calmly pressed it against the stain. Her expression never changed. Richard Whitmore noticed. Something about her composure seemed to bother him. Most people, after a public embarrassment like that, would rush to defend themselves. Naomi didn't either. She simply stood there as though the entire scene existed somewhere beneath her concern. "You know," Ethan continued, glancing at his parents, "they really should check invitations more carefully." Victoria laughed again. "Ethan," but she wasn't stopping him. She was enjoying it. The Whitmores occupied one of the most powerful tables in the room. People listened when they spoke. People laughed when they laughed. And tonight, they clearly believed they were untouchable. Naomi finally looked up. Her eyes moved from Ethan to Victoria, then to Richard. Not angry, not hurt, just observant. Like someone reading the final page of a book before everyone else. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Naomi folded the napkin carefully. "No," she said softly. "Not yet." The answer should have sounded harmless. Instead, it seemed to drain the warmth from the air around them. Ethan smirked. Victoria dismissed the remark entirely. Richard returned to his drink. None of them noticed several guests watching more closely now. None of them noticed a young event coordinator near the stage suddenly freeze in place after recognizing Naomi's face. And none of them realized that the woman standing quietly in front of them was about to become the most important person in the room. The ballroom gradually came back to life, but the energy had changed. Conversations resumed in cautious fragments. Crystal glasses clinked. Soft music drifted from the stage. Yet every few seconds, another glance found its way back to Naomi Brooks. She stood near a marble column at the edge of the reception area, calmly accepting a fresh, sparkling water from a passing server. The stain on her dress remained visible, but she carried herself as if it did not exist. That seemed to frustrate Ethan Whitmore more than anything. He had expected embarrassment, maybe outrage, at the very least, some attempt to defend herself. Instead, Naomi had given him nothing. And for someone accustomed to being the center of every room, being ignored felt like a challenge. Ethan watched her from across the ballroom before turning to his parents. "Who invited her?" he asked. Victoria adjusted a diamond bracelet around her wrist. "No idea." Richard glanced briefly toward Naomi. "Probably somebody's guest." His answer carried complete certainty. In his world, important people arrived in predictable packages. Expensive labels. Familiar last names. Recognizable faces. Naomi fit none of those categories. That alone was enough for him to dismiss her. Moments later, a hostess approached the Whitmore table carrying an updated seating chart. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore," she said politely. "There has been a slight adjustment." Richard barely looked up. "Fine." The hostess pointed toward one of the reserved seats at their table. "This seat is assigned to Ms. Naomi Brooks." Silence followed. Ethan laughed first. "No chance." The hostess checked the tablet in her hands. "I am sorry, sir, but that is the arrangement." Victoria frowned. "There must be a mistake." "No, ma'am." The hostess maintained a professional smile. "The assignment came directly from event leadership." Richard took the tablet from her and studied the seating chart himself. His expression darkened slightly. Naomi's name remained exactly where the hostess said it would be, directly beside the Whitmore family. He handed the tablet back without another word. The hostess thanked him and walked away. Ethan shook his head. "You cannot be serious." Victoria lowered her voice. "Perhaps someone mixed up the guest list." Richard nodded. "That has to be it." Across the room, Naomi calmly made her way toward the table as guests were invited to take their seats for dinner. The massive ballroom glowed beneath dozens of chandeliers. White roses lined the centerpieces. Golden place cards marked every seat. The atmosphere reflected money, influence, and status. The Whitmores considered themselves experts in all three. As Naomi approached, Ethan leaned back in his chair and smirked. "I think you are headed the wrong direction." Several nearby guests heard the comment. Naomi stopped beside her assigned seat and looked down at the name card. Then she looked at Ethan. "Am I?" she asked. Her voice remained calm. Ethan pointed toward the opposite side of the ballroom. "There are plenty of tables back there." A few nervous chuckles emerged from guests seated nearby. Victoria joined in. Perhaps there was confusion. Naomi glanced at her place card once more. "There does not appear to be any confusion." Richard folded his hands together. "These seats are generally reserved for principal partners and major stakeholders." The implication hung in the air. Naomi understood it immediately. So did everyone else. "You do not belong here." It was the same message, just wrapped in more polished language. Naomi slowly pulled out her chair and sat down. The move was simple, quiet, yet it landed with the force of a challenge. Ethan stared. Victoria blinked. Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time all evening, the Whitmores were not controlling the room. Nearby, several guests exchanged curious looks. Across the ballroom, a young event coordinator named Alyssa Grant watched the scene unfold with growing concern. Unlike the Whitmores, she knew exactly who Naomi Brooks was. And as she looked from Naomi to the increasingly irritated faces around the table, one thought kept repeating itself in her mind. They have no idea what they are doing. Dinner service began with all the elegance the Grand Regent was famous for. Servers moved between tables with practiced precision. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. A string quartet filled the ballroom with soft music that floated above the hum of conversation. Yet at the Whitmore table, tension sat heavier than any centerpiece. Ethan had not expected Naomi Brooks to remain in that seat. He certainly had not expected her to look completely comfortable there. The more relaxed she appeared, the more determined he became to make her feel unwelcome. "So," Ethan said as waiters delivered the first course, "what exactly do you do?" The question sounded harmless on the surface. The tone underneath it was not. Naomi folded her napkin across her lap. "I work in finance." Ethan laughed. "Finance is a pretty broad answer." Victoria smiled into her wine glass. "Everyone works in finance these days." Richard nodded. "Or claims to." A few guests nearby shifted uncomfortably. Naomi remained calm. "That is true." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Let me guess. Consulting?" "Something like that," Naomi replied. Her answer only seemed to irritate him further. He wanted details. More accurately, he wanted an opportunity to dismiss them. Across the ballroom, Alyssa Grant stood near the event operations desk pretending to review seating updates. In reality, she had been watching the Whitmore table for nearly 15 minutes. Every instinct told her she should step in. Every professional instinct told her not to. Richard Whitmore was one of the Gala's largest donors. Challenging him publicly could create problems she was not prepared to handle. Still, the knot in her stomach grew tighter. Back at the table, Ethan continued. "You know, this event usually attracts people running billion-dollar companies." He glanced around with a grin. "Not exactly a beginner crowd." Victoria laughed softly. Richard offered no correction. Naomi took a sip of water. I noticed. The answer landed with such confidence that Ethan briefly hesitated. Only briefly. Then you probably understand how important reputation is. Very important. And credibility. That too. Ethan smiled. Good. We agree on something. Several guests exchanged looks. They could hear the conversation turning into something uncomfortable. One woman seated nearby quietly focused on her meal. Another guest checked his phone despite having no new notifications. People often did that when they wanted an excuse to avoid eye contact. The room itself seemed aware that something was wrong. Then came another comment. Victoria looked directly at Naomi's stained dress. It is a shame about the accident earlier. Her expression suggested she was not sorry at all. Although I suppose these events can be intimidating if you are not used to them. Naomi met her gaze. I am quite used to them. Really? Ethan asked. Which ones? Richard chuckled into his drink. Naomi set down her glass carefully. The sound barely registered above the music. The ones where people reveal who they are when they think nobody important is watching. Silence followed. Not a dramatic silence. A quiet one. The kind that makes people suddenly interested in their silverware. Ethan forced a laugh. Victoria looked away first. Richard narrowed his eyes. Something about Naomi's answers bothered him. Every attempt to put her on the defensive seemed to fail. She never reacted the way they expected. She never seemed smaller. Across the ballroom, Alyssa finally made a decision. She approached a senior event manager standing near the stage. We may have a problem, she said quietly. The manager frowned. What kind of problem? Alyssa looked toward the Whitmore table. The kind that could end very badly for someone. Meanwhile, Ethan was already preparing his next joke. He believed he was controlling the evening. He believed the room still belonged to his family. What he did not realize was that more and more people had stopped laughing. The main course arrived beneath silver covers, but very few people at the Whitmore table seemed interested in the food. The conversation had become the attraction. Ethan especially appeared unwilling to let the evening move on. Every time Naomi Brooks answered a question without discomfort, he treated it as an invitation to ask another. Every calm response seemed to challenge his assumption that she would eventually become embarrassed and leave. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, composed and unshaken, while the room slowly shifted around her. So who do you know here? Ethan asked, cutting into his steak. Someone must have invited you. Naomi dabbed her napkin lightly against the wine stain that still marked her dress. Several people. Ethan smiled. That narrows it down. Victoria joined him. Most guests tonight have long-standing relationships with the foundation. Her voice carried the polished tone of someone pretending to be polite. Some of us have supported it for decades. Naomi nodded. That is admirable. The answer should have ended the conversation. It did not. Richard leaned forward slightly. You still have not told us what company you represent. Naomi looked toward the stage where preparations for the keynote portion of the evening were quietly underway. You will find out soon enough. Richard's expression hardened. He was accustomed to receiving direct answers. More importantly, he was accustomed to people wanting his approval. Naomi seemed interested in neither. Around them, neighboring tables had become noticeably quieter. Guests were listening without appearing to listen. The tension spread through the ballroom like an invisible current. Across the room, Alyssa Grant finally reached the senior event manager, Daniel Mercer. She spoke quietly but urgently. You need to stop this. Daniel frowned. Stop what? Alyssa glanced toward the Whitmore table. They do not know who she is. Daniel followed her gaze. Who? For a moment Alyssa simply stared at him. Naomi Brooks. The color drained slightly from Daniel's face. You are kidding. I wish I were. Daniel looked back toward the table. Suddenly the entire situation appeared very different. The wine incident. The comments. The seating dispute. He understood immediately why Alyssa seemed so concerned. Has anyone told the Whitmores? He asked. Alyssa shook her head. I tried to approach Richard earlier. And he dismissed me before I could finish a sentence. Daniel exhaled slowly. Back at the table, Ethan was still enjoying himself. You know what I think, he said. I think you like keeping things mysterious because it sounds impressive. A few guests nearby looked down at their plates. The comment landed poorly. Naomi folded her hands calmly. Do you? Ethan grinned. Absolutely. Victoria laughed. Ethan has always been very good at reading people. Naomi turned toward her. Has he? The question was simple. Yet something about it caused Victoria's smile to weaken. Richard noticed the exchange and decided to reassert control. Experience matters, he said confidently. In business, people learn to recognize who belongs in certain rooms. The statement lingered over the table. Several nearby guests heard it clearly. Naomi met his gaze. That can be a dangerous assumption. Richard offered a thin smile. Not usually. Across the ballroom, Daniel Mercer made a decision. He began walking toward the Whitmore table. Alyssa followed close behind. Neither moved quickly. Neither wanted to create a scene. But both understood that every passing minute increased the chance of one. Meanwhile, Ethan raised his glass and looked directly at Naomi. "Well," he said, still smiling, "this should be interesting." What he did not realize was that for the first time that evening, someone who knew the truth was finally on their way. Daniel Mercer and Alyssa Grant were only halfway across the ballroom when another server approached the Whitmore table carrying a tray stacked with neatly folded white linen towels. The server stopped beside Victoria Whitmore and quietly asked where the extra linens should be placed. Victoria looked at the tray, then at the wine stains still visible on Naomi Brooks's dress. A slow smile appeared on her face. "Perfect timing," she said. She picked up one of the towels and extended it toward Naomi across the table. "Here, you can take care of that before the photographs start." Several guests immediately sensed something was wrong. The words themselves sounded harmless. The tone behind them did not. Ethan grinned. Richard remained silent, making no effort to stop the exchange. Naomi looked at the towel for a moment. She did not reach for it. "Thank you," she said calmly. "I am fine." Victoria continued holding it out. "You are sure? I would hate for people to get the wrong impression." The comment landed heavily. A few guests shifted in their seats. One woman quietly lowered her fork onto her plate. Another glanced toward the stage, wishing the evening program would begin already. Ethan leaned forward. "My mother is just trying to help." Naomi turned her attention toward him. "Is she?" Her voice remained steady, unbothered. Yet something about her composure seemed to make the moment even more uncomfortable. Victoria finally placed the towel beside Naomi's plate. Some people are so determined to prove a point they forget how they look doing it. For the first time all evening, Naomi did not answer immediately. Her eyes settled briefly on the folded towel, and for a moment, another memory surfaced. 25 years earlier, she had been 20 years old, standing inside a private business reception in Chicago. Fresh out of college. Ambitious. Determined. She remembered arriving in her best suit, carrying a folder filled with ideas and financial projections. She remembered the receptionist looking past her and asking whether she was there to collect catering equipment. She remembered the polite smiles that followed, the assumptions, the dismissive glances, the way people had spoken around her rather than to her. She remembered leaving that night and sitting alone in her car beneath a parking garage light. Not angry, not defeated, just certain. Certain that one day she would build something nobody could ignore. The memory faded. The ballroom returned. The chandeliers, the silverware, the quiet tension surrounding the table. Naomi looked up. Her expression had not changed. "Appearances can be misleading," she said softly. Ethan laughed. "That sounds like something people say when appearances are all they have." A few nearby guests exchanged troubled looks. The comments were becoming harder to excuse, harder to pretend were jokes. Across the room, Alyssa increased her pace. "We are running out of time," she whispered. Daniel nodded. He could see it too. Every minute made the situation worse. Back at the table, Richard finally spoke. "Ethan." His son looked over hopefully, expecting support. Richard adjusted his cufflink. "At least let the woman finish her dinner." The remarks sounded like moderation, but the table understood what it really was. Permission. Permission to continue as long as the insults remained polished enough to avoid consequences. Naomi noticed it immediately. So did several guests. The room no longer felt elegant. It felt charged, like the calm moments before a storm arrives. Then Naomi's phone vibrated once beside her plate. A single notification. She glanced down briefly. The message was from Rachel Monroe. 3 simple words appeared on the screen. "Ready when needed." Naomi locked the phone and placed it back on the table. Her expression remained unreadable. Across the ballroom, Daniel and Alyssa finally reached the edge of the Whitmore table. And for the first time that evening, someone who knew exactly who Naomi Brooks was stood close enough to speak. Daniel Mercer stopped beside the table and forced a professional smile. Alyssa Grant stood slightly behind him, her attention fixed on Naomi Brooks. For a brief moment, Daniel considered saying something immediately. Instead, he hesitated. Years of working around powerful donors had taught him caution. Unfortunately, caution was exactly what had allowed the situation to reach this point. "Good evening, everyone," Daniel said. Richard nodded politely. Victoria barely looked up. Ethan appeared annoyed by the interruption. Naomi simply acknowledged him with a calm glance. "We will be beginning the keynote portion of the program shortly," Daniel explained. "Thank you all for joining us tonight." It was a harmless statement, but Alyssa could see the disappointment in Naomi's eyes. Not anger, not frustration, just recognition. Another person choosing comfort over truth. Daniel moved on to the next table. Alyssa remained frozen for half a second before reluctantly following him. Across the ballroom, the stage lights gradually brightened. Staff members adjusted microphones. Large projection screens awakened with soft blue graphics displaying the foundation's logo. The transition toward the evening's main event had begun, yet the Whitmores remained focused on the woman seated beside them. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Looks like your mystery is almost over." Naomi looked toward the stage. "It would appear so." Victoria smiled. "I suppose we will finally learn why you were seated here." Richard raised his glass. "I am curious myself." Naomi nodded politely. "You will not have to wait much longer." Something about her confidence unsettled Richard. The feeling had been growing all evening. Every instinct told him there was information he was missing. Yet pride kept him from asking questions he believed should not need asking. Across the room, Alyssa finally stopped walking. She turned toward Daniel. "We cannot keep waiting." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I know." "Then do something." Daniel looked back toward the stage. The master of ceremonies was already preparing notes. The keynote introduction was less than 10 minutes away. Suddenly, he understood there was no reason to intervene anymore. The truth was about to arrive on its own. Meanwhile, Naomi's phone vibrated once more. She lowered her eyes to the screen. Rachel Monroe had sent a new message. "Documents finalized. Awaiting authorization." Naomi stared at the words for several seconds. Around her, conversations continued. Silverware touched plates. Glasses clinked. Laughter drifted from distant tables. The ballroom looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Elegant, wealthy, successful. Yet beneath the polished surface, everything had changed. Naomi opened a secure message window and typed only 3 words. "Terminate the deal." She reviewed the message once. Then she pressed send. Thousands of miles away, servers processed instructions. Legal teams received alerts. Executives were notified. Internal protocols activated. No announcement accompanied the decision. No dramatic confrontation. No raised voice. Just 3 words traveling silently through a network. Rachel's response arrived less than 30 seconds later. "Understood. Effective immediately." Naomi locked the screen and placed the phone beside her plate. Ethan noticed. "Business emergency?" he asked. "Something like that," Naomi replied. Victoria laughed softly. "Hopefully nothing too serious." Naomi looked directly at her. "For some people, it will be." The answer lingered in the air. Richard frowned. Ethan rolled his eyes. Neither understood what had just happened. Across the ballroom, the lights dimmed slightly. The room gradually quieted. Guests turned their attention toward the stage. The master of ceremonies stepped forward beneath a spotlight. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. Hundreds of eyes focused ahead. And at the Whitmore table, 3 people sat comfortably unaware that the most expensive mistake of their lives had already been made. The spotlight settled on the center of the stage as the master of ceremonies adjusted his notes and smiled at the audience. The ballroom fell silent. Hundreds of conversations dissolved into anticipation. Crystal glasses rested on white tablecloths. Executives, donors, investors, and community leaders directed their attention forward. At the Whitmore table, Ethan appeared mildly bored. Victoria checked her phone one final time before placing it beside her plate. Richard straightened his jacket and prepared for another predictable keynote speech. None of them suspected they were seconds away from becoming the center of the evening for all the wrong reasons. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies began. "Thank you for your extraordinary generosity tonight. Because of your support, countless opportunities have been created for communities across the country." Polite applause followed. The speaker smiled and continued. "Our next guest hardly needs an introduction. She has transformed industries, built one of the most respected investment firms in America, and become a leading voice for economic growth and innovation. Richard's attention sharpened slightly. That description sounded familiar. Over the past decade, her leadership has overseen billions in successful investments, revitalized struggling companies, and created thousands of jobs. Ethan casually reached for his water glass. Victoria nodded politely toward the stage. Tonight, we are honored to welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Capital. The massive screens behind the stage suddenly illuminated. A professional photograph appeared. Naomi Brooks. The image stretched across 40 feet of high-definition display. The ballroom erupted into applause. Ethan froze. The glass stopped halfway to his lips. Victoria's smile vanished instantly. Richard stared at the screen as though the room had tilted beneath him. The photograph remained. So did the name. Naomi Brooks, Chief Executive Officer. Brooks Capital. At the Whitmore table, silence became physical. Heavy. Unavoidable. Slowly, dozens of heads turned away from the stage and toward the woman seated beside them. Guests who had witnessed the evening's events exchanged stunned looks. Others suddenly understood the tension they had sensed all night. Across the ballroom, Alyssa Grant closed her eyes briefly. The moment she had been expecting had finally arrived. The Master of Ceremonies continued speaking. She has also been instrumental in several landmark acquisition projects, including one of the most anticipated strategic partnerships scheduled for announcement this quarter. Richard's face lost color. He knew exactly which partnership that meant. Naomi rose calmly from her chair. The applause grew louder. People stood. More guests joined the ovation. The ballroom that had quietly observed her humiliation now celebrated her presence. Ethan looked up at her with disbelief. "You are Naomi Brooks?" he asked. His voice sounded smaller than it had all evening. Naomi glanced toward him. "Yes." One word. Nothing more. Yet it shattered every assumption he had carried throughout the night. Victoria lowered her eyes. Richard struggled to form a sentence. Naomi stepped away from the table. Then she stopped. The room remained focused on her. She turned back toward the Whitmores one final time. Her voice was calm enough that only their table could clearly hear it. "Earlier tonight," she said, "your son laughed when he thought I did not belong here." Nobody answered. Ethan could not. Victoria could not. Richard could not. Naomi continued. "You questioned my credibility before learning my name." Richard swallowed hard. The applause from the ballroom continued around them. It sounded distant now. Naomi held his gaze. "Tomorrow morning, we were supposed to finalize a $650 million acquisition." The words landed like a closing door. Richard's expression collapsed. He understood immediately. Every detail connected at once. Every warning sign. Every missed opportunity to stop the situation. Every moment he had chosen pride instead of curiosity. Naomi offered a polite smile. Not triumphant. Not angry. Simply certain. "You mistook wealth for power," she said. "That mistake just became very expensive." Then she turned and walked toward the stage while the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Naomi Brooks stepped onto the stage as applause rolled through the ballroom like a rising tide. Hundreds of guests stood in recognition. Some admired her accomplishments. Others simply understood they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the evening ended. Beneath the chandeliers, Naomi thanked the audience with a graceful nod before approaching the podium. Her stained navy dress remained unchanged. The mark from the spilled wine was still visible beneath the lights. Yet somehow it no longer looked like an embarrassment. It looked like evidence. Back at the Whitmore table, nobody spoke. Ethan stared toward the stage with a stunned expression. Victoria sat perfectly still, her earlier confidence completely gone. Richard looked down at his phone for the third time in less than a minute. The screen remained dark. No messages. No explanations. Just growing uncertainty. On stage, Naomi adjusted the microphone. The ballroom gradually quieted until only silence remained. "Thank you for being here tonight," she began. Her voice carried effortlessly through the room. Calm, measured, confident. This event celebrates opportunity. It celebrates leadership. Most importantly, it celebrates character. Guests listened closely. Some glanced toward the Whitmore table. Others kept their eyes fixed on the stage. Everyone could feel the tension lingering beneath the surface. Naomi continued. "Success is often measured in numbers. Revenue, assets, market value. But those things tell only part of the story. Richard's phone suddenly vibrated. His heart skipped. He looked down immediately. A new email had arrived. Sender, Rachel Monroe, Executive Office, Brooks Capital. Subject line, Strategic Acquisition Status Update. Richard opened it. The color drained from his face. Victoria noticed instantly. What is it? She whispered. Richard did not answer. His eyes moved across the screen. Formal language. Legal review. Effective immediately. Acquisition terminated. Ethan leaned closer. Dad. Still no answer. On stage, Naomi remained composed. The true measure of leadership appears when no advantage exists. When there is nothing to gain from kindness. Nothing to gain from respect. Several guests nodded. Others understood exactly what she was referring to. The ballroom had become a courtroom without anyone announcing it. Every witness was present. Every detail remained fresh. Richard finally handed the phone to Victoria. Her eyes widened as she read. No, she whispered. No, this cannot be real. But it was. The $650 million acquisition was gone. Months of negotiations. Countless meetings. Financial projections. Expansion plans. Investor expectations. All gone with a single decision. Ethan looked between his parents. Panic began replacing confusion. What happened? Richard lowered his voice. The deal is over. Ethan blinked. What do you mean over? Richard stared toward the stage. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely defeated. She canceled it. The words felt almost impossible to say aloud. Around them, nearby guests had started checking their own phones. News traveled quickly among executives. Messages of quiet conversations erupted across neighboring tables. The information was already moving through the room. On stage, Naomi continued speaking as though none of it concerned her personally. A company can recover from financial losses, she said. Markets change. Opportunities come and go. Every sentence felt earned. Across the ballroom, Alyssa Grant watched the Whitmore family in silence. Daniel Mercer stood beside her. Neither said anything. They did not need to. The consequences were unfolding in real time. Richard slowly lowered his head. Victoria stared at the terminated acquisition notice. Ethan looked toward Naomi as if seeing her for the first time. And on the stage, beneath the brightest light in the room, Naomi Brooks never mentioned revenge, never mentioned humiliation, and never mentioned the wine. She simply stood there while the weight of their own actions completed the story for her. The standing ovation lasted longer than anyone expected. When Naomi Brooks finally stepped away from the podium, guests remained on their feet, applauding not only her accomplishments but the dignity she had displayed throughout the evening. She had not embarrassed anyone publicly. She had not demanded sympathy. She had not retaliated with anger. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive. And once it did, nothing else was necessary. The ballroom gradually returned to motion. Conversations resumed. Donors gathered near the stage. Business leaders waited for an opportunity to speak with her. Yet Naomi moved calmly through the crowd with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the moment she entered the hotel. The stain from the wine remained visible on her dress. Nobody seemed to notice anymore. Near the exit, Alyssa Grant finally approached her. Ms. Brooks, she said softly. Naomi turned and smiled. Alyssa, the young coordinator looked surprised. You know my name? Naomi nodded. I make it a point to remember people who try to do the right thing. Alyssa glanced toward the Whitmore table. I should have spoken up sooner. Naomi shook her head gently. You spoke up when it mattered. The answer seemed to lift a weight from Alyssa's shoulders. Across the ballroom, the Whitmores remained seated. Guests passed by their table without stopping. A few offered polite nods. Most did not. Richard stared at the acquisition termination notice one final time before locking his phone. The words had not changed. Neither had the reality. Victoria sat silently beside him. For the first time all evening, she appeared uncertain of what to say. Ethan looked smaller than he had hours earlier. Not because anyone had humiliated him, because consequences had finally entered a life that had rarely required him to face them. As Naomi approached the ballroom exit, she heard footsteps behind her. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. Ms. Brooks. Richard's voice carried none of its earlier confidence. Naomi stopped and faced him. Victoria and Ethan stood nearby. The three of them looked nothing like the family that had controlled the room at dinner. Richard cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. Naomi listened quietly. We all do, Victoria added. Ethan lowered his eyes. I was wrong. The words sounded sincere. Perhaps for the first time that evening. Naomi regarded them calmly. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then she nodded. I appreciate that. Richard looked relieved for a brief moment. Is there anything we can do? Naomi glanced toward the ballroom where hundreds of guests were still discussing the events of the night. Learn from it. Richard looked confused. Naomi continued. You spent the evening measuring people by appearances. You never asked who someone was. You decided who mattered before learning a single fact. Nobody argued. They could not. Every word was true. Ethan swallowed hard. I understand. Naomi offered a faint smile. Good. Because business can recover from mistakes. Character only improves when people choose to change. The statement settled over them quietly. No lecture. No humiliation. Just a lesson. Naomi stepped toward the elevators. The doors opened with a soft chime. Before entering, she turned back one final time. The Whitmores stood together beneath the ballroom lights, surrounded by everything money could buy and confronted by something it could not. Respect. I did not raise my voice tonight, Naomi said. I raised the standard. The elevator doors closed. The ballroom continued behind her. Conversations. Music. Reflections. But the lesson remained.